With respect to the moral argument for the existence of God, I first argued that if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Here, Professor Atkins clearly misunderstood my argument. He said, it is disgusting to assert that atheists can't live good moral lives. And of course, I would never think of saying something like that. That's not the argument. What I'm saying is that if there is no God, then there is no transcendent foundation for objective, mind-independent moral values and duties. Moral values and duties are just the spin-offs of the evolutionary social project or program, and they have no objective validity. If you were to rewind the film of human evolution and shoot it anew, a very different type of creature with very different values and duties might well have evolved, and it would be guilty of speciesism to claim that our morality is objectively true rather than theirs. Richard Dawkins has said, there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. And what I would ask Professor Atkins is, why on atheism is Richard Dawkins wrong? It seems to me that on atheism he's right, and indeed reading Professor Atkins' books, I think that Professor Atkins would actually agree with this, that moral values are just the byproducts of sociobiological evolution and have no objective validity. But my second premise is that objective moral values and duties do exist. In moral experience, we apprehend a realm of objective moral values, and there's no more reason to deny their objectivity than the objectivity of the physical world around us. So if you agree with me that there are certain things that are truly evil, like racial discrimination, hatred, abuse of spouses, rape of little children, then you will agree with me that God exists as a transcendent foundation for these objective moral values. Thirdly, I suggested that the evidence for Jesus' resurrection points to the existence of God, and shared the empty tomb, the appearances, and the origin of the Christian faith. Now, Dr. Atkins doesn't deny those facts so much as appeal to David Hume's argument against miracles to say that it's impossible to prove miracles using evidence because miracles are so improbable. I have a twofold response to this. First of all, David Hume didn't understand the probability calculus. It wasn't developed in David Hume's day. And therefore, contemporary theorists know that Hume's argument is mathematically fallacious. It is demonstrably fallacious. Peter Millikan, whom I debated earlier this week, a Hume scholar and expert, admits that Hume's maxim is fallacious. It is false, he says. What Hume neglected was the crucial probability that we should have the evidence we do if the resurrection had not occurred. That is to say, what is the probability that there should be an empty tomb, post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection if there were no resurrection, if it hadn't occurred? That probability is very, very, very low. And that can offset any intrinsic improbability in the resurrection itself. So Hume simply didn't understand the probability calculus, and a contemporary scientist should not appeal to David Hume to justify his skepticism concerning miracles. Secondly, why think that a resurrection is intrinsically improbable? What is improbable is that Jesus rose naturally from the dead. That is incredibly improbable, that all the cells in Jesus' body spontaneously and naturally came back to life again. I agree that's improbable, but that's not the hypothesis. The hypothesis is that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if the background information you consider includes the cosmological and the moral arguments, then I don't think it's at all improbable that if God exists, he should raise Jesus of Nazareth from the dead. So there's simply no intrinsic improbability in such an event. Dr. Atkins says it's not the simplest explanation. Well, I think that's arguable, but in any case, you have to also consider explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility, and so forth. And when you do, I think the resurrection emerges head and shoulders above any of the far-fetched alternatives such as the conspiracy hypothesis suggested by Professor Atkins this evening.
Thank you. Professor Atkins, your second rebuttal.
It was said by Dr. Craig earlier that this is not an argument between science and religion. You bet it is. It is all about evidence and what is evidence and basing your belief on evidence. There is no evidence whatsoever for any assertion that Dr. Craig has made this evening. You have to accept that everything you have heard him say can be accepted on faith and cannot be demonstrated by evidence. What I have tried to do this evening is to show that scientists are moving cautiously forwards on the basis of collecting evidence and being guided towards understanding. That is the difference. If you start from the position of being faithful, that is, you start from the view that God does exist, then of course you can explain absolutely everything. But how childish the explanations are. They are, God wanted it. God wanted Jesus to be reconstituted. God did it. God wanted the world. He could make a world. These are fairy stories. These aren't explanations. These do not lead you to understanding. These do not lead you to comprehension. These do not lead you to getting through a day and saying, I have learned something about the nature of the world. They are lazy slogans. They are not explanations. Yes, when I presented my remarks, they were based on faith. I have been accused by Dr. Craig of having a kind of faith. I don't deny that, but it is a faith that can be tested this side of the grave, rather than the faith that he professes that can be tested only on the other side of the grave. Whenever you listen to a philosopher speaking, there is always an air of pessimism. Another remark might illustrate what I have in mind. Auguste Comte, in the middle of the 19th century, the founder of sociology, said, under no circumstances ever will we know the composition of the stars and the temperatures of their surfaces. You show me a star, I will tell you its composition, I will tell you its temperature. Philosophers say, you will never do this. Scientists say, wait, we are getting there, and we're getting there reliably. My point this evening is that the questions that we are debating about the origin of the universe, the composition of the universe, which actually Dr. Craig has ignored in my opening remarks, the purpose of the universe, which once again Dr. Craig ignored in my presentation, has not in any sense rebutted. All those things are extraordinarily difficult questions. But science, in its cautious, tortoise-like way, is edging towards finding ways to answer them. And it is edging towards them without needing to invoke a God to present, if you like, to introduce a supernatural element into the discussion. So Dr. Craig's remarks were all about wizards and the supernatural. Mine were about finding reliable explanations that everyone can understand. I mean, think about the resurrection, if that's pivotal to this evening's discussion. The fact that a number of people saw Jesus after he was crucified is outweighed by the fact, perhaps, that even more people saw Elvis. But, was Elvis resurrected after he died? It's a well-known Elvis effect that you're desperate to see someone that you have lost. I think, as you've listened to this evening, you've seen a stark contrast between assertion, certainty that God did it, and my caution in saying, give us time. On the basis of the evidence that we can succeed and are succeeding in discovering how the world works without invoking a God, there is no reason to suppose that we will not in due course get there. And that is the crucial point. As to morality, one is led by religion into dreadful corners of the world. Let me remind you of an article that appeared in The Independent last week. It touches upon Manchester. Worshippers in Manchester, perhaps you were among them, although what I'm about to say suggests that you were not. Worshippers in Manchester have stopped taking life-saving drugs after being persuaded about the healing power of God. And a BBC London investigation yesterday revealed that at least 3 women with HIV/AIDS have died after they stopped taking medication on the advice of their pastors. Now, why did God let them die? You can see the danger that the idea of God introduces into the concept of what is right and what is wrong. The pastors were evil people to tell them to stop taking their medication, and they were guided, they thought, by God. I would prefer not to be guided by that particular God.
Thank you. We now move to the closing statements from each of our 2 protagonists, starting first with Professor Craig.
Well, again, I want to thank Professor Atkins for participating in this stimulating debate this evening, and I hope that you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Let's draw together some of the threads of this debate in this closing speech and see if we can draw some conclusions. First, have we seen any good arguments for theism? Well, it seems to me that we certainly have. First, we had the cosmological argument based on the origin of the universe. I presented evidence, scientific and philosophical, that the universe began to exist, and that has not been refuted. I then argued that if the universe began to exist, there had to be a transcendent cause of the universe. And here all Professor Atkins can say is that science is edging toward the answers. Ladies and gentlemen, science is not edging toward explaining how being can come out of non-being. That is a philosophical, metaphysical question, not a physical question. What science is edging toward is answering the question, did the universe have a beginning, or is the universe infinite in the past? And all of the evidence that I am familiar with is on the side of the scale that said the universe is finite in the past. It is not past eternal. The Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem requires the finitude of the universe in the past. I know of no evidence whatsoever that the universe has existed from infinity. Moreover, there's nothing in science that would explain how something can come into being out of nothing. Indeed, as I showed, science presupposes the principle that out of nothing, nothing comes. Otherwise, there would be utter chaos in the scientific enterprise. You wouldn't be able to explain anything scientifically because you could just say it came into being out of nothing.